Relish in the fact of all being in this room together. I'm Davy Knittle. I'm assistant professor of English at the University of Delaware. I am a Penn English PhD alum and a person whose life was massively improved by all the folks in GSWS, and it's nice to extend that gratitude in this space. Our speakers, two of whom are here, and one of whom is on Zoom, will join us in this session. Same structure as the previous session, so one presentation, Perry Zurn will start. I'll introduce Perry in a second. Second presentation from Gossett, who's joining us on Zoom, and then third presentation from Francisco J. Galarte, who is right here. And then we'll have some time for conversation among the panelists, and then some time for conversation with all of you. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to the panelists for being here. So first is Perry Zurn. Perry Zurn is Associate Professor of Philosophy at American University and Affiliate Faculty in the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies. Zurn will be a Fellow at the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University, 23-24, and a Visiting Scholar at the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, 23-25. Lucky Penn. Awesome. He researches primarily in political philosophy, critical theory, and transgender studies, and collaborates in psychology and network neuroscience. He's the author of Curiosity and Power, The Politics of Inquiry, 2021, and the co-author of Curious Minds, The Power of Connection, MIT Press, 2022. He is also the co-editor of Active Intolerance, Michel Foucault and the Prison's Information Group and the Future of Abolition, 2016, Carceral Notebooks 12, 2017, Curiosity Studies, A New Ecology of Knowledge, 2020, and Intolerable, Writings from Michel Foucault and the Prison's Information Group, 1970 to 1980, 2021. He's currently at work on a new monograph, How We Make Each Other, Trans-Poetics at the Edge of the University, under contract Duke University Press, and co-editing Trans Philosophy, Meaning and Mattering, which is under review. Please join me in welcoming Perry Zurn.
Thanks so much for having me and for being here and for sharing in these conversations. I've already learned a lot and I'm excited about learning more. Today I want to head my remarks as the poetics of trans pedagogy. And we'll say a little bit more about what I mean by poetics or want to mean by poetics moving forward here. First, I want to not start with poetics, I want to start with policies. And I want to start by kind of pointing out what I see as mainstreamed trans-inclusive policies and then sideline trans-inclusive policies, because I think this framing helps us think about the elements of trans pedagogies that get mainstreamed and the elements of trans pedagogy that get sidelined. So in a broader trans-inclusive policy framework in the universities across the US, there are really 5 big policy changes that typically happen for trans inclusion. Number 1, adding a non-discrimination clause to the university and or city in which the university is, adding specifically gender identity and gender expression. Second, pronouns and name change policies. These are really common ways of changing universities for trans inclusion. Improving inclusive bathrooms and housing for students and sometimes faculty. And then adding trans healthcare coverage as well, both mental health care coverage as well as surgeries and hormones if desired. And then lastly, trans programming to raise awareness across campus. So these are really the big 5, and a lot of people are still struggling with the big 5. But some people are doing fairly well. And then the things that are really sidelined tend to be things around curriculum. So trans scholarship methods and pedagogies, around collections, trans library holdings and archives, around personnel, actually recruiting trans students, staff, and faculty, around research, supporting trans-led research, and then around community, engaging local trans communities. And the reason, one of the things I like to point out when I have this list is to say, the things that are mainstreamed practices are things that Chase Bank and Starbucks are also working on. And that means that the things that are mainstreamed here are not specific to the university, are not addressing the heart of what the university does, which is our curriculum, our research, our collections, our personnel, all of those things. So I want to preface this and then turn to questions of pedagogy, and in this case, I tried to get the most stereotypical flyer version of a university classroom I could find from my university website. So that is the context of this particular, if this particular photo. We can talk about that later, but especially at a PWI. But in a college classroom, what are the things that are central, right? So I think that a lot of times we may change our pedagogies, and this is more especially for cis or ally folks in the room. We might think about trans inclusion thinking about, by saying, you know, well, how do I talk, again, share pronouns and names, or how do I construct my syllabus, or do I tell people where the closest inclusive bathroom is? All good things, one should do those things, but those are really, in a sense, peripheral to what you do as a professor in a classroom setting. And so I want to talk about something far more central to what each of us is doing, and that is our trans methods. So I want to talk about our methods in our disciplines, which has already come up to some degree, and our methods in the classroom, and what does it mean to trans those methods or to use trans methods in a classroom. There's a lot that has been done to try to develop trans-inclusive methods in different disciplines, and we've already heard that there's also a lot of limitations to that. That is still like a question. What is a trans method in each of our fields looks like? What does transing the existing methods look like? So there's a lot of work left to be done. One of the things I'm going to do here is simply pivot to say there's one way to answer the question of trans methods and what it might look like in the classroom and in pedagogy, and that is to look at trans studies appeals to trans grammars or to trans punctuation marks as symbols of what these methods could be. So this is just one way to start tackling this kind of question. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to say what grammars and punctuation marks has trans studies in the US appealed to as markers of its methods, and what might that mean for trans pedagogy in the classroom. And as I trace those appeals, one of the things I want to do is also point out a critique of those appeals, because a lot of times trans studies appeals to these punctuation marks and grammars is subtended by a particular ableism. All of this will make sense. So first, ellipsis. The ellipsis has become a mark of the trans work of undoing or of poking a hole in cis heteronormativity. So think about how you might teach your field or engage in your classroom through elliptical pedagogies, okay? The ellipsis comes from a word that means to put a leave in, Reflecting on the poetry of Carrie Edwards, Trace Peterson muses on the ellipsis as an answer to the problem of identity writing. And Regina Consul cites Kaji Amin as thinking the ellipsis is a tool by which to press open the soldering of discourse. So the ellipsis here among trans scholars has been used as this kind of rupture of identity writing and a rupture of the soldering of discourse. How might one do that in your own fields? The ellipsis is also, though, there's more to it. It's a marker of informal or undisciplined or ungovernable speech, the ... 1950s grammarian Eric Partridge says it intimates that there's a pause in action, a hiatus in the thinking, a hesitation in the dialogue that signals the informality of speech. What would it mean to signal in our work, in our coursework, the informalities that are true of our fields, that are true of the people about which we are speaking? But ellipsis is also related to the ellipse, the mathematical ellipse, and elliptical movement. So Jacques Derrida has a nice piece in which he talks about this relationship, and he says, in both cases, you see a circle that refuses closure, both in the ellipsis and in the ellipse. A circle that refuses closure, a missing of the mark, a misfitting of the mark, shortfalls and falling short, and for that reason, a way of inching around. Here is a trans, and I would argue also crip grammar, this failure, this missing of the mark, this circle that refuses to close. Second case study here, hyphen. Obviously long used in discussions of racialized and migrant identities in the US context, the hyphen has also been appealed to quite widely in trans studies, again, as established in the United States, Susan Stryker, Paisley Cura, and Lisa Jean Moore, in their 2008 field-defining special issue of Women's Studies Quarterly, say they want to turn from the nominalism of simply trans to the relationality of trans hyphen. So it allows them to talk about, sure, trans hyphen gender, but also transnational, transdisciplinary, translation, trans whatever. And they think that that is one of the promises of trans studies. But there are richer and also more troubling resources, I think, in hyphen's history. So in ancient Greek, one of the things that is true of writing in ancient Greek early on was that there wasn't a separation between words. So if you had transgender lives, this would all be one string of letters. And the hyphen came in as a way of separating the words, but not simply separating, but establishing an unstable relationship between the words. Say these two words belong and are separate, right? Belong and are separate. Few centuries later, with the Gutenberg Bible, which you see an example of here, one of the things, Gutenberg, right, was obsessed with these justified lines, these perfectly justified lines. But in order to do those, you can't actually maintain justification. You have to set to the side these marginal hyphens that say, actually, I've just cut this word in half, please see next line, right? In doing so, the hyphen holds meaning, anchors meaning in the very margins of the text. Again, think metaphorically about your fields. Where are those marginal hyphens, those things that hold meaning outside of the justified lines of the discourse that you typically teach and know? And then today, of course, hyphens are often, or perhaps most often, used as for breaks in sense. Whenever in literature there's a sob or a stammer or a gasp, you'll often see a hyphen. Sob, stammer, gasp, breaks in sense. What kind of trans/crypt grammar might be here in the hyphen, and how might it challenge how we teach what we teach and how we construct the discourses in our classrooms or our learning environments? Last example, the asterisk. How can I not, right? One must speak of the asterisk. And the asterisk is sort of like the fancy younger sibling of the hyphen. If you think about hyphens, one way to think about it is as the asterisk is three hyphens sort of in a wheel together, right? We just want to magnify our hyphenatedness in a sense. Obviously, the appeal in trans studies to the asterisk has ridden on the coattails of the computer search function, where if you add an asterisk after a term, it'll give you the term plus any other thing it's been related to or smushed next to. And that has been an inspiration for the appeal in trans studies. And that appeal has been really formalized in the case of TSQ, which does include, doing this research, I was like, it does? Yes, it does. It includes an asterisk. That is part of its construction, necessary construction of the title. T*SQ in 2014. And Stryker and Cura at the time said they wanted to do that to signal the inherently unfinishable combinatory work of trans. Inherently unfinishable combinatory work of trans. And then in 2018, Duke University Press announced the launch of the Asterisk series, which is a series in trans theory, and they described the goal of that particular series as to capture whatever comes after trans. There's a lot forward-looking. What's next? What is it connected to? Let's go. But again, I think there's an important. I want to say that trans studies has given the asterisk a star-like quality. In that it becomes fast-paced and gregarious and well-connected, but I do want to pose a crypt challenge to that use of the asterisk. So, and to that, again, I turn back to history. So the Gregorian chant and psalmody, for example, uses an asterisk to signal a long pause, a pause longer than other pauses. Where notes scramble up and down the staff, clamoring like euphoric climbers and sliders, the asterisk stops things in their tracks long enough to cause discomfort. What might it mean to think trans asterisk as a long pause, or precisely a suspension of movement rather than a proliferation of movement? A slowness, a stumbling along, going neither fast nor far, a halting or a haltedness. Another thing about the asterisk history, or actually the biology of the asterisk. In order to say the word asterisk, which is remarkably difficult, I'm realizing as I say it to you now, you have to use a glottal stop. You have to close your speaking orifice. there has to actually be a moment of silence. What would it mean to think trans asterisk not as a word glut in the way that it has been appealed to in trans studies, but as silence? What would it mean to think the asterisk, as Saidiya Hartman does, with the unsaid and the unsayable, the archival absences, and perhaps with blackness itself for her? What would it mean to think trans asterisk not as the many things that can be said, but as those that can't, or at least slow speech, perhaps slurred speech? Last pause here for the asterisks. Grammatically, of course, the asterisk can signal an abrupt or considerable transition. We may all use this, right? When we get to the conclusion that we have no name for, we put some asterisks up there first. It's a break, a refusal to link, a rejection of connection. What would it mean to think trans asterisk not as summoning the many things that can be linked, but the many things that can't be linked? What if the asterisk marked the broken links, the chasms of incommensurability, what doesn't connect about gender or anything else for that matter? What if trans asterisk were precisely the energy to break off, break away, find a break, take a break, or embrace a breakdown? So I'm offering these three, again, as trans grammars, but also with the crip critiques, or possible trans crip grammars, and asking, again, what would it mean to teach? What does it mean to teach in a way that emphasizes all of these relations, but also their breakages in our own fields? There are, of course, more signs that one could appeal to. I think the X in particular would be especially helpful and interesting, and I know Francisco Galarte has written about this in the room as well. So the X obviously can mean the undefined and undefinable of trans, specifically, or in the case of its addition to Latinx, but it can also mean wrong answer, right? False, X'd out. Similarly, the slash for Unzaldua is a cut, right? And it can certainly be a cut in the flesh, but for her it can also be a cut in the mind that opens a portal to other ways of imagining and seeing the world, non-normative ways of imagining and seeing the world. And that cut could be related with Mika Cardenas' work or Ava Hayward's work, and thinking of trans scars, and there's all kinds of things that we could do there. Or maybe even Marquis Bay has written about what it means to be a question mark for trans. So I think there's a lot of these appeals, interestingly, to punctuation marks and to grammatical marks. And I think that they offer ways forward for trans methodologies, but I do want to pose crip pauses to them. In summarizing where it is that I want to go here. Poetics of trans pedagogy from this lens, right, which is a very limited one, but an interesting one. Trans pedagogy is not just what we do, but how we do it. And I know that for a lot of us folks in the room, we already know that, but I think it warrants returning to. It's not just what we do in the classroom, it's how we do it. We have to think about our methods in the classroom, but also our methods in the field and what we're doing with them or not doing with them. Trans pedagogy is also not just the sense we build, but how we break it. So the ellipsis, there's an escaping of discourse in a way that is ungovernable. How does one do that in a classroom? How does one facilitate that in the classroom? How does the hyphen, breaking units into uneasy relationships as much as putting them into relation. Don't just say, oh, and this applies to trans folks. Here's a trans issue that kind of relates to what we're talking about, right? That's a easy relation hyphen. What about breaking it, right? This is a way in which a trans issue doesn't actually relate to this, actually breaks open whatever it is we're talking about, and we don't know what the next step is in thinking. Or asterisks, putting a pause in, tangling as much as attaching. Coming to this place where we have to stop talking in a classroom. Trans pedagogy then can't be just additive or accumulative in its approach, and I think it is primarily spoken of in that way, but has to be a habit of disruption and loss. And I want to propose that trans pedagogy may need to be non-trivially trans-mad in the sense that Kavar uses, and I'll say a little bit about that. I don't just mean to connect trans pedagogies with disability pedagogies or access pedagogies, although I think that's important. From what we know, 39% of trans folks report as studied, report having a disability or an impairment of some kind. That means that when we're talking about trans pedagogies, we better be talking about disability pedagogies, right? And folks like Alexander Burrill, J. Logan Smilges, and Cameron Awkward-Rich have done much to help us think about neurotrans, neuroqueer, queer crip, and trans maladjustment. But I don't just mean to be proposing that or to be highlighting that here. I do want to talk about how our epistemologies in the classroom, how we construct and understand knowledge together. Kavar defines trans madness as, and I quote, a wandering and wondering praxis, anticipating and refusing neurotypical, sane, cis supervision in both the structure of our thoughts and the comportment of our bodies. Both the structure of our thoughts and the comportment of our bodies. It is a trying to cultivate mad sense or breaks in sense and sanity in our citation practices, our epistemologies, our discourses, our writing, our conversations, our assessment rubrics, our skill goals in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This means that we have to move beyond thinking about, for example, pedagogies of access and pedagogies of care, which I think trans folks and trans studies folks who've been working in pedagogy do a good job of trying to build, some of those resonances out. But we need to also be talking about a pedagogy of the mad, the maladjusted, the unruly, the glitch, the pastiche, the disorderly, the blur, and the borderline. What is a pedagogy of the blur? I want to close with a quick story. In my first job as a professor, a visiting professor at Hampshire College in spring 2016, there were TERF lyrics that were passed out in the cafeteria one morning. And it really ruptured the campus, which is a relatively queer trans idyllic place, despite all of its other problems, right? That's true. Trans folks, including myself, gathered the next day for pizza and soda to read poetry by trans poets and to then flyer the poems around campus. One of the poems we read was Lilith Latini's Gloria Talks Back to Patti Smith, an earlier version than the one that was published in 2013. And I have just two sections from that, or two stanzas from that poem. The pine barrens only grow by setting fire to their body. Each pine cone's tiered shell already embodies flame, ready to reach and open up reflection. Red needles over the sandy soil, I told myself this story at the precipice of choosing, glory burnt across my heart. I think in the task of trans inclusion or trans affirmation in universities and specifically in pedagogies, sometimes we can be so busy planting pine forests, we forget to learn the wisdom of the pine cone, its undoing and its fire. What is the grammar, perhaps the trans mad grammar of a pine cone? What is the pedagogy of a pine cone? Generation and destruction, from singularity to scatter, breaking open, breaking up, and breaking down. How are we thinking this break and this fire in the classroom, not just about the classroom? Thanks.
Our next speaker is Gossett. Gossett is a Black, non-binary femme writer and critical theorist specializing in queer trans studies, aesthetic theory, abolitionist thought, and Black study. They received their doctorate in women's and gender studies from Rutgers University, New Brunswick in May 2021. They received a BA in African American Studies from Morehouse College, an MAT in Social Studies from Brown University, and an MA in History from the University of Pennsylvania, and were a 2019-2020 Helena Rubinstein Fellow in the Whitney Independent Study Program. Che is currently the Racial Justice Postdoctoral Scholar with the Initiative for a Just Society at Columbia Law School. Che recently received a Ruth Steffen Fellowship from the Beinecke Library at Yale University for the summer of 2022. Che will also be a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School's Animal Law and Policy Program for the fall 2022 semester. Spring semester 2023, they will be spending time at Oxford University as a visiting fellow at the Center for Life Writing at Wolfson College and the Rothermere American Institute, as well as the Center for Visual Culture at the University of Cambridge. They are joining us in the internet. Please join me in welcoming Che Gossett.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to present. I wish it could only be in person. I want to open by thanking the Program in Gender and Sexuality Women's Studies, the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies as well at Penn, and my fellow co-panelists. What I'm going to be talking about today is in relationship to my work around abolition and art. And my work traces or thinks through the ways in which Black contemporary artists activate abolition as both a historical, well, through the register of the historical and the grammar of the historical, but also through the grammar of futurity, as abolition remains both an unfinished event and an open invitation to radical revolutionary reconstruction. Thinking about the legacy of Angela Davis and, of course, W.B. Du Bois, and the ways in which abolition puts pressure on the category of the human, on the configuration of the political, democracy, and also the ways in which queer and trans abolitionist activism have insurgently, since some of the historical figures have contributed to this project that I'll be talking about, insurgently challenged the coordinates, expanded abolitionist imaginaries externally and also internally, kind of in the abolitionist interior, meaning like the ways in which abolition has evolved as a political horizon and social horizon. And so I'm thinking about how the aesthetic, the role it plays in abolition, and how abolitionist Black trans artists are thinking through in a kind of affirmative speculation, an aesthetic kind of pedagogy that we might attune ourselves to, and to think about what's being transmitted through that in relationship to trans-affirming pedagogies. So I'm going to focus on the work of two artists today for this brief talk. The first is actually my sibling, the artist and writer and activist Tourmaline, who is based in New York City. So I'm going to share my screen so I can show some work. And this quote by Saidiya Hartman frames the theoretical kind of intervention that my work aims to make and be situated in, which is that of Black feminist, trans, and Black radical thought, and even as those are inseparable, obviously. The afterlife of slavery is not only a political and social problem, but an aesthetic one as well. Tourmaline's film Silesia, and these images are from Chapter New York, which is the gallery where Silesia has had kind of many residences, including at the MoMA and other galleries and iterations, actually at the Venice Biennale, which was a really incredible event and space in which to see this work. And Silesia itself refers to underwater, subterranean gods of the sea. And this is Mary Jones. And these are all kind of brief shots from the film. And in the film, Mary Jones, who is a historical figure who was criminalized as a Black trans sex worker, arrested in 1836 in New York City, and made a kind of sensationalist, kind of the object of a sensationalist media sensationalism, where a poster was created of Mary Jones calling her the man monster, and it circulated as a lithograph in a kind of viral way for that time period. And yet Mary Jones was also defiant in her abolitionist sociality and aesthetic sociality as well. And so when she was accosted by the judge at the court in New York, and this is where I first found out about this actually by reading Tavi and Nyong'o's amalgamation schemes, and then ordering the transcript of this interrogation, really, she was asked, why do you dress this way? And her rejoinder to the judge is that she's always dressed this way amongst people of my own color. And so that kind of always as a temporal index helps us to think through the not only the contemporaneity, the historical present of Black transness, which is often kind of portrayed as a sort of new identity formation. And instead, I think it opens up questions about Black trans and gender nonconformativity and the historical register itself. And in the film, there's a kind of critical fabulation at work through Tourmaline's intervention, where Jones is part of a Black community in, what is now Central Park that was destroyed as part of the creation of Central Park. And in this community, there's a kind of radical sense of intimacy, but one that isn't a sort of flat intimacy or a kind of empty or like vacant intimacy, but one that actually has a lot of texture, and sometimes there's a rub between members of the community. And so one of the major figures of the community in this film is Peter Dermott, who's a Black abolitionist newspaper editor. And he, in the film, kind of disagrees with Mary Jones's sex work choices. And so there's this kind of internal intramural friction and dialogue that's all about like the politics of racial respectability, but it's really powerful and interesting because the whole community itself is under duress and criminalized. So there's no kind of recourse to a sort of figuration of the innocent subject, and rather they're all navigating various forms of criminalization, which is one of the forms that anti-Blackness, legal anti-Blackness takes, of course. And so there's a kind of radical fugitivity at work here, that where the versions of it kind of bounce off each other in a really vibrant and exciting and troubling and interesting way. And so the film also plays with temporality. So Jones herself is able to call upon and rely upon African spiritual cosmological traditions. And so we can think here of religions, syncretism. For instance, Candomblé would be like a version of that, for example. And she uses this as a way to speculate. And speculation here is multi and polysemic, I would say. So on the one hand, speculation is a form of seeing into the future and that kind of imaginary. On the other hand, speculation is a way of kind of actualizing that future. And so it's a form of praxis. And so she's able to jump. And in this way, time is kind of folded in the film. And so Jones, who is being chased by the police, escapes into the future. But that future is not an escape. As we know, the anti-Blackness of the afterlife of slavery lives on in the historical present. So there's some really interesting questions that are raised about abolition itself. Like, what would it take to create a space and a topography, a political landscape in which Jones was is a liberated person, and how does the imaginary, speculative contribute to this kind of project? Also, what's really fascinating about the film is that not only time is folded, but kind of presences and realities. So there's a kind of documentary intervention and thread that also weaves throughout the film. So here we're looking at Sylvia Rivera being interviewed actually as an unhoused person. She was living in an encampment, and she's remarking what she did over the course of her life, often to Marsha Johnson, about the River Jordan. And it's the quote here says, "You've got to keep fighting, girlie, because it's not time for you to cross the River Jordan." And she's laughing about it. And so Marsha and Sylvia often thought about the River Jordan as a crossing point between life and death, or the border between life and death, and the border not, or a threshold rather, less of a border, more of a threshold, a point of contiguity, because there in Marsha and in Sylvia and in Jones, in this speculative historical imaginary, there's an aesthetic pedagogy, but there's also this kind of like spiritual pedagogy. And so in Marsha's life, in Sylvia Rivera's life, there was a cosmological and Black and brown trans spiritual practice that they relied on, which is also being kind of dramatized through Jones's, Mary Jones's portrayal here as well in Silesia. And so there's a dialogue happening that's co-presences, that is not about this kind of obsession with death and the kind of figuration of Black transness, Black trans woman in particular, is kind of melancholic, abject subjects in need of rescue, and this kind of like instrumentalization of Black trans death that Riley Snorton and Jan Harita Warren have written about so powerfully in their piece on trans necropolitics. But rather, this is thinking through like, what are the practices and pedagogies that are at work. And this is Jones imprisoned. She was imprisoned at Sing Sing, and she uses magic to fly and transport herself rather to the present. And the film closes with a really powerful line: "We can be anything we want to be." The other artist that I want to mention here is Keon Williams, who's a Black trans artist based in New York City, and who has done really phenomenal work around Blackness and ecology, Black transness and ecology. And I want to focus on one piece by Williams, and it's called Meditations on the Making of America. And so I wanted to preface this with a quote from Nahum Chandler from his book, X, The Problem of the Negro as a Problem for Thought, where he brings Du Bois to bear on ontology, the political, and the historical present, both in that text and then also a newer text called Beyond This Narrow Now. So, it is widely believed that a real thing called America exists. Yet, it is precisely this idea of America in itself that we should not accept without examination. And so this examination and this deconstruction, this kind of reconfiguration, throwing into crisis the sovereignty, which is, of course, racial and colonial, structured by securitization, is the very object of Williams's work, Meditations on the Making of America. And so in this work, which is incredibly moving, the audience is situated behind what Williams calls a vessel, a womb, an abyss. And this is an indexing of the work of Glissant, Kamal Braithwaite, and also, of course, Saidiya Hartman's work, Venus in Two Acts, where she thinks about the slave ship as a vessel, and also, of course, the work of Hortense Spillers, where she thinks through the Middle Passage and it's kind of violent, or violent is too polite a word, but it's destructive ontological force. And so dirt or soil from this womb or abyss or crypt is projectile thrown at the canvas until it forms the kind of topography of America. And this is an image of Williams after that happens. And also Williams in different performances will use a kind of hair as whip to construct the soil into the shape of the American nation state as it is now. But it's always referencing to the Caribbean because the soil itself actually was transported from St. Croix, which is where Williams's family is from. And so it references the making of America. A meditation on the making of America is also, in this case, a meditation on the making of the Caribbean as well. And so what's really fascinating about this piece, aside from the beauty of it, and is these cup fungi that are growing inside the soil. And Williams isn't only interested in the kind of destruction, but also in this question of livability. And they have written and spoken about the ways in which the cup fungi dramatize and illustrate how life persists even in conditions in which might be imagined that it's not hospitable, and that life itself is extinguished and so imperiled that it's impossible to imagine its persistence. And yet their life does flourish. And so this is about a kind of pedagogy around that. And there's a closer view. And it's also obviously, Williams is always thinking through the kind of eco-poetics of Blackness and life. And then finally, this is a image from a piece that Williams did in relationship to the archive and critical fabulation that deals with the material from it is kind of excavated from Marlon Briggs's archive, which is held at Stanford, where Williams was an undergraduate, and helped to research and process the archive. And Riggs's film Brother to Brother, and also Black Is, Black Ain't, there's Black transness imminent and intramural and moving and activated in those works. And so Williams found footage with Jessie Harris, who's a Black trans femme person who was in the films, and reconstructs it. And in the actual exhibit itself, there's mirrors that are placed in front, kind of hanging in front of this video of Harris. And it is a kind of confrontation and thinking through about Blackness, AIDS, the archive, via the speculative, via critical fabulation, and conversations with history, really. And so at different points, Williams has kind of interfaced with this. And then at other points, as part of the exhibit, where I saw it, it was called Nobody Promised You Tomorrow, which is a quote from Marsha B. Johnson. And that was at the Brooklyn Museum. That was a kind of event where the kind of logic or museumological logic of the space meant that you as a spectator were mirrored in this way, and kind of having this conversation about Black trans, AIDS, historicity, the archive, and critical fabulation reimagining this archive and thinking about the aesthetic and political resonances to today. So these are all, I think, part of an essential part of having a conversation around transforming pedagogy, Blackness, the role of art, and the kind of transmission, pedagogy as a transmission, an aesthetic education, and a relationship between past and present that I think, and I hope, might be one that we can all discuss. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Che. That was wonderful. Our final speaker is Francisco J. Galarte. Francisco J. Galarte is an associate professor of American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches courses in Chicanx, Latinx, and transgender studies. He was born and based in Brawley, California, located in the Imperial Valley along the US-Mexico border, and identifies strongly as a transfronterizo, meaning that the borderlands inform his creative and scholarly projects. His most recent articles have appeared in publications including Aztlan, Journal of Chicano Studies, Chicana Latina Studies Journal, and TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. He holds a PhD in Educational Policy Studies with a minor in Latina and Latino Studies from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Before arriving to the University of New Mexico, he was an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. While at the University of Arizona, he was a member of the Transgender Studies Research Cluster, TSRC, at the University of Arizona, a collective of faculty that is the first of its kind in the world that brings together scholars in transgender studies from various disciplinary backgrounds to foster cross-collaboration in the form of research, writing, and teaching. Please join me in welcoming Francisco.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let me get this off so you can hear me a little more clearly. So first of all, of course, I'd like to thank my presenters, everyone that's spoken so far. I've enjoyed being a student and a learner today with all of you, and also to the organizers of this wonderful event. I think the comments that I have or that I prepared are structured in a way in which I'm doing a combination of the various approaches that we've had today, both kind of having us think about what we do in the classroom, but also thinking theoretically about pedagogy as a concept. So I'd like to start off and say, you know, I have a PhD in education. I don't really do work in educational studies, to be quite honest. I have a PhD in education mostly because I had an advisor who felt like I was someone that needed to get a PhD. And education was a department, and I had an advisor who worked with me in relationship to my learning style, right? And the way that I moved through the world as a student and as a first-generation student with an undiagnosed neurodivergence, you know, all of those things, right? So this is like me being the first-generation student who ends up getting a PhD without necessarily really imagining themselves as a professor. And so education is the degree that I got, and I was very much trained to think about pedagogy in the Freirean sense. I share a birthday with Paulo Freire too, which is interesting in and of itself and might have kind of scripted the outcome here for me. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to read a little bit from a piece that I wrote quite some time ago that appeared in the first issue of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. It's a keyword essay for pedagogy. And so I'm going to bring that back to life since it's been such quite a bit of time since I've looked at it, and then talk about kind of like failure, right? Like what it means to fail in the classroom and its inevitabilities, and then also think about the ways in which we might desire or might be erring on the side of a desire to assimilate trans into teaching and pedagogy. And assimilation itself has its own kind of very complicated history that is typically thought of more in relationship to citizenship, right, and immigration, but assimilation as a concept kind of becomes useful to think about the neoliberal project of taking up best practices, so to speak, around trans pedagogy. And so I say this, and I start with my kind of story as a first-generation student because, I mean, I think oftentimes who gets left out of the conversations when we talk about pedagogy is kind of like the students, right? What types of learners they are, what we imagine about them when they step into the classroom, and then also as teachers, what we imagine a text or a syllabus to even do. And so there's a way in which I'm asking us to think about both what we are imagining of our students and what they kind of come to the classroom with, and kind of letting that go, and then also letting go of the preciousness of the project of putting together a syllabus that aims to capture the end-all be-all, or what your take on is on a particular subject or topic, and the mastery that kind of accompanies that outsetting or kind of undertaking that project. So as promised, I'm going to start with reading from my essay on pedagogy. So pedagogy, narrowly construed, is the study of teaching and learning. More generally, it pertains to the social construction of knowledge, values, and experiences. The common assumption that the classroom is the exclusive site where pedagogy transpires is challenged by educational theorists such as Henry Giroux, Antonia Darder, and Bell Hooks, whose definitions of pedagogy extended beyond the classroom, and who, like Paulo Freire, advanced the concept of pedagogy as a practice of freedom. Freire similarly redefines educator to mean more than a mere classroom instructor. For him, being an educator should encompass the multiple perspectives of, quote, border intellectual, social activist, critical researcher, moral agent, radical philosopher, and political revolutionary, end quote. Pedagogy, broadly defined in this way, engages questions of teaching and learning with questions of culture and power, of democracy and citizenship. It points to the multiplicity of sites, corporeal, spatial, temporal, and psychic, in which education takes place and where, most importantly, knowledge is produced. Transgender studies is a framework or lens through which to theorize the myriad ways in which people understand, name, experience, and claim gender in relationship to such other processes as racialization, class, nationalism, and globalization, needs to incorporate a critical pedagogical perspective. In the 2008 Women's Studies Quarterly Special Trans issue, Vic Munoz and Edney K. Garrison coined the term trans pedagogies. They sought to find a word to capture the dialogic relationship between trans subjects and pedagogical practices. They envisioned the term as a coalitional concept that encompassed transsexual, transgender, and genderqueer perspectives, through which an analysis of the production of knowledge could be linked conceptually to varying experiences of gender socialization or gender identity in diverse contexts. What might such trans pedagogy encompass? A pedagogical perspective on transgender studies should, at minimum, note that teaching and learning about transgender phenomena take place across a spectrum of social practices and locations, and that trans pedagogies are part of a broader public politics, not solely limited to what goes on in schools. But more expansively, a pedagogical perspective on transgender phenomena can also help unsettle historically and contextually specific knowledges that shape understandings of normative gender. Trans pedagogy should offer students the tools they need to participate in the political and economic power structures that shape the boundaries of gender categories, with the goal of changing those structures in ways that create greater freedom. In a trans-pedagogical approach, processes of learning become political mechanisms through which identities can be shaped and desires mobilized, and through which the experience of bodily materiality and everyday life can take form and acquire meaning. Trans pedagogies supply a discursive mode of critique for challenging the production of social hierarchies, identities, and ideologies across local and national boundaries. They represent both a mode of cultural production and a type of cultural criticism for questioning the conditions under which knowledge of gendered embodiment is produced. They provide a space for affective engagement, for the affirmation or rejection of values, and for the inhabitation, negotiation, or refusal of culturally prescribed gendered subject positions. Understanding pedagogy as a mode of cultural production in this way underscores its performative nature. It is how theory becomes practice. Stratagems of oppositional praxis are precisely what critical trans-pedagogical practices should aim to produce. They must shift the framework available for understanding, describing, and addressing the multiple and varying vulnerabilities to violence faced by transgender subjects. Paying attention to the highly variable and sometimes contradicting narratives of transgender subjects are used to describe and explain experiences as classist, racist, sexist, and ableist exploitation is part of a necessary pedagogical practice. It situates knowledge production in specific or local acts of knowing. Trans pedagogies must keep up with the continually shifting terms and conditions through which gender is named, imagined, and theorized, as well as with the ongoing neoliberal depoliticization of public life and the impoverishment of public discourse. Trans-pedagogical perspectives and approaches need to ask how knowledge of transgender phenomena is constructed through this absence as well as through its presence and circulation in the public sphere. Proliferating trans knowledges in the public sphere is only the first step of a radical educational agenda. The heart of an effective trans pedagogy, buttressed by rigorous intellectual work and political courage, is to link theory and practice to create new modes of resistance and collective struggle. So I read a few kind of excerpts from the larger essay, and the excerpts that I picked, I think, illuminate both my innocence, right, and youth as a scholar in terms of what I imagined teaching and learning can enact. And then there's me now, who 10 years later still fundamentally believes in a lot of these things, especially in thinking about my students as producers of knowledge and cultivating their experiences and what they gain from a text to kind of create a space of exchange. And then on the other hand, I only recently taught transgender studies for the first time this year. So being at the University of Arizona, where I had the company of other trans studies faculty, it was basically a competition. So imagine a world in which you had to vie to teach transgender studies. And being someone who also taught in Latinx and Chicanx studies, I more often than not was tasked with covering those kind of required classes. So in many ways, I was often split between trans studies, Chicanx and Latinx studies, and my embodiedness as a racialized trans person meant that I was whatever that was kind of imagined to kind of look like curricularly. So now at the University of New Mexico, I'm the one that teaches trans studies. And so I wanted to give like some examples of what, worked and didn't work from that class. And then, for me, teaching that class was more so an affirmation and kind of a way to make sense of these thoughts that I put out there in the world in 2013, where I thought that all I would be teaching was transgender studies, that I would be able to use trans studies as a course to bring this to life. And I was able to enact a lot of these aims that I had in this essay, but through general education classes and the other classes that I teach. And so what that illuminates to me is that by locating trans studies or intro to trans studies as like an exceptional space in which we aim to get students to want to enroll in that class, really kind of undoes the project here, right? Like we want to think creatively about how, as my co-panelists mentioned, right, like what is the threat of changing curricular aims, right? So what is it about changing curriculum that is so dangerous in terms of unsettling all of our disciplinary commitments and that involves like what we think is canonical to teach, what we must teach, right? I think curricular changes don't ask us to unsettle that. We're just being asked to enliven our pedagogical practices and how we imagine those concepts to make sense that are kind of standard or given in your respective disciplines of study. And so for me, I wanted to really kind of think or get at what, what is it about teaching that creates a precarity and a danger in wanting to take up the challenge, right? Of wanting to be experimental in how you might use gender as a analytical concept or as an animating force to like the set of text that you're putting together in a syllabus, right? Or like the to use words that we have to use our course objectives, right? Our learning outcomes, right? So whatever we want to name it, what might that challenge be to enliven gender in different types of ways? And so for me, I went back into all of my sources on pedagogy, and I came back to this very early essay by Jose Esteban Munoz that is entitled "Teaching Minoritarian Language and Love," and it's published in 2004. And so, in re-examining that, it really propelled me to home in on what I feel animates my own pedagogy and the desire to meet students where they are and move through their complicated relationships to text, and also my own complicated relationships to text and the narratives that I'm trying to um, bring out in the course of a class or in a classroom space. So Munoz describes his pedagogy as, quote, shaped in part by a technique that is offered by Laplanche and Pontalis regarding countertransference. They suggest the option of the analyst as, quote, exploiting the countertransference manifestations in a controlled fashion for the work of analysis, end quote. He says, it often takes little to redirect this advice to the classroom and the scene of pedagogy. It is important to understand the ways in which the production of knowledge, and more specifically, the production of the desire for knowledge, is a two-way street. Failure in this enterprise is implicit, right? It's expected even, or perhaps a rite of passage for educators that we prefer not to talk about, right? So we like to think about all of the wins, right? Like all of the things that went really, really great in our classroom, and we don't often, scrutinize the failure or what went wrong, because it went wrong, we scrap it, we don't revisit it. But what would that mean to take on those failures and to interrogate them a little bit and to understand them that it's okay to fail in some context. Um, and so what Munoz is referring to is a showing of the themes of one's pedagogy, to lay bare what he says, this is his phrase that we all know, the here and now of pedagogy, which has everything to do with promise, possibility, and potentiality, but not necessarily an inevitability of failure. Munoz concludes his essay by referencing a meditation by Horton Spillers on psychoanalysis and race. And he does so to de-universalize the psychoanalytic tools he deploys to reiterate the stakes of what he's describing as a minoritarian pedagogy. So this is a quote that he pulls out from Spillers. Quote, it is not then the task of psychoanalytical protocol to effect the translation from the muteness of desire wish, that which shames and baffles the subject, even if its origins are dim, not especially known, into an articulated syntactic particularity. This seems to me as a passable psychoanalytic goal, but perhaps there is more to it than simply a nice thing to happen. At the very least, I'm suggesting that an aspect of the emancipatory project hinges on what would appear to be a simple self-attention, except that reaching the articulation requires a process, that of making one's subjectness the object of a disciplined and potentially displaceable attentiveness. So, according to Munoz, for Spillers, the psychoanalytical protocol brims with emancipatory potentiality in that it helps one combat the certain muteness that social logics like homophobia, racism, and sexism would project onto the minoritarian subject. Much like Munoz, the emancipatory project here is helping others come into their own, not only as speaking subjects, but also professing subjects. This is one of the ultimate stakes of Munoz's pedagogy, and now I realize my own, right? So what does it mean to have students come into their own as professing subjects and producers of knowledge? What does that look like in a classroom space, especially alongside the project of then the desire to compel trans narratives as the examples of how to teach trans or how to teach gender in different types of ways. So this stake requires a teacher to examine their side of that two-way street. Why a trans pedagogy? From where does the desire to transform pedagogy emerge? The project must come from a place that does not solely wish to assimilate trans pedagogy into the folds of how you teach. And here I turn to very, very briefly to the concept of assimilation to reference how in the here and now, DEI projects increasingly require faculty and students to engage with trans politics or trans issues or phenomena, whatever we want to however we want to index that, suggests that we must engage this or take on these topics to be, quote, good educators. So here, I want to pause for a minute on Catherine Ramirez's definition of assimilation and her book, Assimilation, A History of Assimilation is an interesting text to turn to, mostly for me as I'm thinking through brown subjects, right, who are disciplined through schools in different types of ways in schooling, and kind of assimilation as a process that requires an absorption, that requires being compelled to take on that good role, to not be bad learners, to not be bad teachers. So Ramirez reminds us that assimilation has been, quote, used synonymously with civilization through the early 20th century as the opposite of savagery and barbarism, as a, quote, achieved social order or way of life, and as a modern social process whose effects are reckoned as good, bad, or mixed. Civilization is a conceptual precursor of assimilation as social and cultural process. So the assimilation of trans phenomena, practices, and narratives into one's teaching can dangerously come close to delineating the boundaries between us and not us, and is above all a pillar, and this is above all a pillar of U.S. nation-making projects, and really kind of illuminates various relationships of power. So I come back to the question of why trans pedagogy, right? So there's, on the one hand, we're being asked to really kind of take the needs of trans students, right? And make sure that they can make it through a classroom and an experience in, college university spaces. But then there's also the why of, to what degree will you transform your curricular kind of aspirations or aims, right? So what my co-panelists mentioned in terms of these 5 areas that are delineated that are the easiest for an institution to do don't require an interrogation of your curricular investments, right? But when we don't interrogate the how and why, we don't want to change, right? Not only our pedagogical practices, but our intellectual investments in certain concepts and how we teach them, right? Like that's the question here for me, right? So like when there's not a critical interrogation in changing the outcome of discussing certain topics or ideas or sets of commitments in relation to discipline, if we're not willing to push at the boundaries or to go back to Munoz, to expose the seams, right, to lay it bare, then we err close to the side of assimilation, right? So how best can we absorb the needs and the central tenets of trans pedagogies into our own pedagogy, right? So assimilation is to absorb, right, and to literally have it become part of, where the bit of trans gets lost, right, and is not visible, but then becomes very hyper visible at the moment in which we might have a situation that ends in failure in particular types of ways. And so for me, responding to this prompt really challenged me both because I had written this essay so long ago and what I imagined pedagogy to do. Now, as I am teaching different types of classes, I'm also reminded of what I was compelling myself and others to do in different types of ways. And looking back at my teaching, I see the different ways in which I was enacting this, but then coming to teach a trans studies class also really shows the ways in which, I wasn't necessarily always accomplishing that project, right? Failure was kind of a part of the process. And as I mentioned before, something that we don't often take seriously in kind of mapping out our pedagogical process and aims and goals, so to speak. And so for me, the goal for trans pedagogy is not to be the best or to be better at teaching trans, right? But rather learning how trans transforms my practices in different types of ways, or how I might be willing to transform my practices and my disciplinary commitments. So I'm going to stop there because I want us to have time for Q&A, and I didn't.
Thank you all so much to our panelists. Those were such wonderful and generative talks. We have some time for y'all to be in conversation with one another before we open up to audience questions. I want to invite you to ask questions of one another. I also have lots of things I'm so excited to ask you, and I'm happy to start with a question if you want some time to think. So one place to start that I was super interested in each of your talks was thinking, so we've been thinking implicitly about trans pedagogy as equating to the classroom. And each of you are asking us to think, Francisco, explicitly in your talk, thinking about sites of pedagogy beyond the classroom, but Perry, in your talk, thinking about the scene you end with the student event of students reading poems. And Jay, the way that you're asking us to think about gallery spaces, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about where you see a trans pedagogy taking your work beyond the classroom, whether that's taking students in a formal pedagogical context out of the classroom, or whether that's, Francisco, in the way that you're asking us, applying a trans pedagogy methodologically, and Perry, you're giving us some of this language also to pedagogical contexts beyond a formal classroom space.
I can start. I just didn't want to go because I felt like was talking a lot. But I mean, for me, I am interested in sites outside of the classroom. Being someone who teaches at a HSI, right, where we have first generation students who, I think one of the marked differences that I've noticed in terms of hearing how folks talk about their students and what they're able to accomplish in a classroom, like at a HSI, I have students who are working 3 jobs, right? So realistically, I'm literally telling them what paragraphs and reading to focus on, right? So that's a more heavy-handed approach, but taking pedagogy outside of the classroom and kind of showing spaces in which they can see the theories that I'm proposing to them, or how I'm asking them to think about things differently, such as teaching a fashion class right now, right? So like to have them think about the clothes that they wear almost all the time also requires me to take them to places in which they might be able to see a garment created, right? Like, I don't know how to sew. I'd love to teach them how to sew, but I don't know how. My family they're all seamstress, so I should. But I just don't have, anyway, that's a longer story. But taking them to see like weavers up in New Mexico, right, into the traditions of Chimayo, and to see where and how Ralph Lauren and all of these other kind of brands get their imaginary of like the West, right? I can realize that because I live in New Mexico, and I can also have them think about kind of the gendered relations that are being enacted in the creation of a garment, right? So it's like extending the classroom in that way, but also knowing that with students that work 4 jobs, not everyone can go. So it's also about creating the kind of economic possibilities for them to be able to undertake that as well, right? To say, I'm gonna ask for time off from my job because I need to do this, right? And that also means being creative about institutional resources to incentivize that in a particular way. That's just a short kind of example.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that I was wanting to do in my remarks was to also push not just beyond not just to learning environments in general, but to think where's learning happening, and it's happening not just in our classrooms, but in our conferences, for example, or in our articles and our books that our colleagues are reading. Right, those are learning spaces. The whole idea is that people learn something through and in those spaces. So I do want to think. I think that we can't just think about. I think when we're thinking about trans pedagogies, we have to think about knowledge production structures in general and where they are and how they too need to be transformed in conversation. So just expanding a sense of learning environments. But then I also want to pause and say what we assume learning is constrains what we understand to be learning environments. And I think the challenge, especially from transcript and disability and mad studies, is to say, how we've conceptualized learning in a traditional sense um, is sanist in many ways and is ableist in many ways and is makes cis sense, one could say, in a lot of instances, but needs to be radically disrupted. What we think of as learning itself needs to be radically disrupted, and then that's going to also disrupt what we think learning environments actually are.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I'm thinking so much about what both of you, how you both responded. Um, I think I've been really influenced and really a kind of lifelong student of abolitionist pedagogy. And for the past, I guess, 2 years, my sibling Tourmaline has been finishing a kind of creative nonfiction book on Marsha P. Johnson, and I've been assisting her with a lot of archival research, which has been kind of an amazing project. It's a forthcoming book. It'll be out from Random House sometime in 2024, but we've been able to kind of unearth new archival material around Marsha. And it has meant kind of sitting with the 70s and the late 60s and these kind of spaces of Black trans study. And study in the sense that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have the resonances of that. They define it, I think, in the under comments as what you do with other people. Just think about Perry's comment about what learning is. And so I think activist spaces, trans activist spaces have been really central to my understanding of pedagogy. Abolitionist spaces have been central to my understanding of pedagogy. And I just was Googling actually when Perry, when you were doing kind of the grammatical, etymological, I looked up pedagogy and I didn't realize that like the ancient Greek kind of origin story around it is about like the figure of the slave who would bring the child to as a part of like as the kind of servant of pedagogy, pedagogical. So the slave, the figure of the slave is wrapped up with the kind of etymology and historicity of that word itself, which speaks to the really the importance and significance of the ways in which that kind of pedagogical historicity is undermined in our actions and everything we're talking about today, really. And I think the last thing I would say is just thinking about activist trans pedagogy. There's, so much of a political genealogy around that and so many groups, both formal and informal, that could be mentioned. But I went to, during the pandemic, a massive protest in front of the Brooklyn Museum. And I think there were like over 20,000 people. And it was the biggest protest I had ever been at in general. And of course, in particular around trans insurgency, sociality, life. And it made me, I think that as a side of pedagogy was really powerful. And it also made me wonder like how to sustain that kind of energy, when there's not the call for the specific protest. And so maybe a question I have is about like pedagogy and historical continuity. Yeah, so, and then I also have some other thoughts. Sorry to take up a lot of virtual time or whatever, about the anagrammatical, which is, the work of Christina Sharp in The Wake. She talks about anagrammatical Blackness. And I think, Perry, when you were talking about trans and kind of political grammar, it made me wonder about like what are the theoretical resources that might be in that work for a project like that. So thanks.
So much. We have about 5 minutes, Maria. And so if y'all have questions for one another, if there are audience questions, this would be a great time for them. And then at 2:30, we're going to pause and take a coffee break before we reconvene at 3. But we still have a few minutes to take some questions if we want to open it up to the audience, stuff that folks want to ask our panelists.
Thanks so much for this panel and for the conversation that's been happening all day. I want to maybe say that across each of the papers, whether and sometimes language in terms of thinking about crip, abolition, decolonial, I was drawn to something that seemed like um, the role of refusal in trans pedagogy, and I'm curious to hear you all reflect on um, whether or not and how refusal is constitutive to how you were approaching the question and how you approach the classroom.
I want to jump in and say it reminds me of one of your first slides, which was the refusal of identity and inclusion and objecthood. So refusal from the
I'm gonna jump in, Chair, so I don't want to interrupt you. So, um, yeah, I think that refusal is a big part of the project. It's a refusal to, for me, it's refusal really kind of makes its way in kind of not creating a syllabus or like a narrative that I imagine is going to make sense in the ways in which the students are coming in by thinking about like the title of the class, or so to speak, right? And then there's also kind of the refusal to use the traditional frames in terms of like assignment goals and things like that, or like rubrics. So I really have fundamentally changed the way that I grade my students. I use a scale in terms of like, you know, 5, like 5 means that you did well in the class and they're graded not necessarily assignment by assignment, but like as a whole. And it's very much tied to everyone's different capacities as a student. So I refuse to imagine all of my students coming in with the same capacity to learn and to take in information and to demonstrate that. And I don't think is that's necessarily inherently a trans pedagogical thing, but I definitely know that teaching loads and loads of trans students over time, I have been re-educated by them to, they've been the most vocal in terms of pushing me to abandon whatever I imagined in terms of what they're going to get out of both the content and then also how they're going to manifest that in the form of an assignment, right? So to make sense of the concepts. So refusal for me has been refusing the norms of what we value in terms of being able to grade a student.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. I think that the kind of practices of refusal run through definitely like the work of Tourmaline around this kind of like fugitivity, refusal of the kind of the visual violence of the archive, of normative conditions of transvisibility. Um, yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about like the aesthetics of that refusal and those practices. So I want to think about that more, but I really appreciate that question.
maybe just to add one more thing about refusal and its relationship to refuse, waste, um, in which is I think shared across all of these kind of um, disciplinary and social histories we're talking about. But in the classroom, it now makes me think about failure. Right, that a lot of times we look back at our moments of having failed in a classroom as a waste of everyone's time. But what would it mean to invite wasting time into the classroom? I think that's a different orientation.
Probably a great place to pause. Please join me in thanking our panelists for the wonderful presentations.